My stepmother laughed, throwing the copy of my grandmother's will directly into my face as the paper scattered across the lawyer's floor. She stared at me with pure venom, shouting that she would tie me up in lawsuits until I was completely ruined and forced onto the streets. Behind her, my own father quietly turned his back on me, refusing to look me in the eye as he signed the court papers to steal my inheritance. They brought a massive team of high-priced attorneys to crush me, confident that a quiet, grieving granddaughter stood no chance. But as I sat alone at the defense table, I didn't say a single word. I simply opened my briefcase and handed the judge a single, hidden document. The moment his eyes hit that one quiet sentence written by my grandmother years ago, the entire courtroom went dead silent, and my stepmother's triumphant smile completely froze. What did that hidden sentence say that instantly destroyed their entire trap? Hit that subscribe button right now to uncover how the loudest person in the room lost absolutely everything to the quietest. My name is Alexia Kerr, and I have always believed that buildings hold the souls of the people who loved them. At 26 years old, I work as a historical restoration architect, a profession that requires immense patience, a sharp eye for hidden details, and a deep respect for the past. While others, my age, are drawn to the sleek, cold lines of modern skyscrapers, I find my purpose in saving old structures from crumbling into oblivion. People often tell me that my personality mirrors my work. I am quiet, deeply observant, and rarely raise my voice. I prefer to listen, to analyze, and to let my actions speak for themselves. This calm demeanor is not a sign of weakness. It is a shield I built over the years, a way to survive the turbulent dynamics of the family I was born into. For as long as I can remember, my true sanctuary was not the house where my father lived, but a magnificent century-old Victorian estate located on the peaceful outskirts of the city. This house belonged to my grandmother, Claire Kerr. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, featuring a wraparound porch, stained glass windows that danced with color every sunrise, and solid oak floors that groaned gently like old friends welcoming you home. Growing up, our daily life inside those walls was a beautiful symphony of warmth and simplicity. Grandma Claire and I would spend our afternoons in the sun-drenched kitchen, baking bread or sketching the intricate moldings of the ceiling. Financially, we were comfortable but modest. Grandma Claire lived on a fixed pension, yet our true wealth was measured in the laughter shared over a single pot of tea and the absolute security of knowing we were loved. Unfortunately, the harmony inside Grandma Claire's house stood in stark contrast to the rest of my family. My biological father, Robert Kerr, was a weak man who constantly drifted wherever the wind blew. Years ago, after my mother passed away, he married a woman named Marta, and our family dynamic fractured completely. Marta was a stark contrast to everything Grandma Claire stood for. She was glamorous, loud, and deeply manipulative, viewing the world through a lens of absolute greed. To Marta, everything had a price tag, and status was the only currency that mattered. My father quickly became a shadow in his own home, entirely subservient to Marta's demanding and vocal nature. They spent money they did not have, constantly chasing a lavish lifestyle that kept them on the brink of financial chaos. Because I refused to join their shallow world, I was quietly pushed to the fringes of their lives. I became the daughter who was only remembered when a chore needed to be done. But I never complained. Instead, I retreated further into the loving embrace of Grandma Claire and her beautiful Victorian home. It was there that I learned the value of integrity and the strength of a quiet spirit. As I entered my mid-20s, balancing my burgeoning career with my devotion to my grandmother, I truly believed that as long as I had Grandma Claire and this sanctuary of wood and glass, I could survive any emotional storm my stepmother tried to brew. Little did I know, the foundation of our quiet life was about to be tested in ways I could never have imagined. For a long time, however, the peaceful rhythm of our days continued to shield us from the outside world. Life inside the grand Victorian house moved with a gentle, comforting predictability that made me feel entirely secure. Every morning, the sweet aroma of freshly brewed chamomile tea filled the hallways, and I would find Grandma Claire sitting in her favorite velvet armchair by the bay window, reading a historical fiction novel or watching the blue jays gather at the bird feeder outside. Even as her steps grew slower and her breath a bit more labored, her eyes never lost that sharp, intelligent sparkle that always made me feel completely understood without me having to utter a single word. My career as a restoration architect was finally taking root, and every small milestone I achieved felt like a victory we shared together. I would bring my blueprints home, spreading the large rolled sheets of paper across the heavy mahogany dining table, and Grandma Claire would lean over them with a magnifying glass, admiring the intricate details. We spent countless evenings discussing our dreams for the future. I told her about my ultimate dream: to one day fully restore this very house, preserving every single piece of crown molding and reinforcing its aging beams so it could stand proud for another 100 years. Grandma Claire would always smile softly, patting my hand with her fragile, wrinkled fingers, and whisper that the house already belonged to the person who loved it most. During those quiet years, I became Grandma Claire's primary caretaker as her health gradually declined. It was an honor, not a burden. I managed her medications, drove her to her doctor appointments, and sat by her bedside during the long, restless nights when her arthritis kept her awake. We were perfectly content in our self-contained world of mutual devotion, needing nothing from the outside. The rest of the family remained comfortably distant, rarely visiting and showing absolutely no interest in the elderly woman who had given them everything, unless they needed a loan. My father, Robert, and my stepmother, Marta, were entirely consumed by their own superficial lives, attending endless high society galas and accumulating debts to maintain an illusion of grandeur they could not afford. Yet, beneath this beautiful blanket of domestic tranquility, the first subtle shifts of a gathering storm began to whisper through the old house. It started with the telephone. Suddenly, after months of absolute silence, the vintage rotary phone in the hallway began to ring at odd hours of the evening. Whenever I answered, Marta's sharp, piercing voice would cut through the line, bypassing any polite pleasantries or inquiries about Grandma Claire's comfort. Instead, she would ask deeply specific, urgent questions about Grandma's medical prognoses, the exact medications she was taking, and whether her memory was still intact. My quiet nature kept me from demanding answers, but a cold chill began to settle deep within my chest every time the phone rang, a silent warning that greed was watching us from afar. That chilly foreboding turned into a harsh reality just 6 months later, when the fragile thread holding Grandma Claire's health together finally broke. On a rainy Tuesday evening, with her hand held tightly in mine, my beloved grandmother took her final, quiet breath. The grief that washed over me was a heavy, suffocating wave, leaving me feeling utterly untethered in the massive, silent house that she had occupied for decades. The true storm, however, did not arrive with her passing, but on the very day of her funeral. I stood by the muddy gravesite in my black wool coat, my eyes swollen and my heart aching as the casket was slowly lowered into the earth. I looked across the small gathering, searching for my father, Robert. He stood a few feet away, looking uncomfortable, his eyes darting nervously toward his wife. Marta stood beside him, completely detached from the solemnity of the occasion. She wore an oversized pair of designer sunglasses and a lavish fur trim coat, adjusting her lipstick and checking her diamond-encrusted watch, as if the entire service were nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her busy social schedule. The moment the final prayer concluded and the mourners began to disperse, Marta did not offer me a hug, nor did my father offer a single word of comfort. Instead, Marta turned on her heel and marched directly toward her luxury sedan, gesturing sharply for my father to follow. When I drove back to the Victorian estate an hour later, my heart sank into my stomach. Parking in the driveway were 2 large, unfamiliar moving vans. The heavy oak front doors of my sanctuary were wide open, letting the cold, damp wind howl through the grand hallway. I walked inside, my boots clicking softly against the hardwood, only to find a scene that made my breath catch in my throat. Marta was already standing in the center of the living room, barking orders at 2 hired movers who were carrying heavy cardboard boxers. Several large suitcases were neatly lined up against the staircase. My father was hovering near the fireplace, uncomfortably shifting his weight from one foot to the other, unable to look me in the eye. Marta turned around, her eyes scanning the high ceilings with an unmistakable look of possessive triumph. I stopped at the threshold, my hands clenched tightly inside my coat pockets. I did not scream, nor did I demand to know what they were doing. I simply stood there, a silent anchor in the middle of their chaotic invasion, watching them carefully. Marta noticed my presence and offered a cold, patronizing smile, crossing her arms over her chest. She casually informed me that since Grandma Claire was gone, there was no longer any reason for me to occupy such a massive piece of prime real estate alone. Without a single shred of shame, she announced that she and my father were moving in immediately to prepare the property for sale. A deep, unsettling worry bloomed in my chest, but I remained perfectly still, observing the depth of their greed, knowing that the real battle had just begun. The tension reached its absolute boiling point the following Monday, when we were called to the mahogany-paneled office of Mr. Harrison, Grandma Claire, as longtime family attorney, for the official reading of the last will and testament. The room felt suffocatingly small. I sat quietly in a corner chair, clutching a worn silk handkerchief that belonged to Grandma, while Marta and my father occupied the prime leather seats directly in front of the large mahogany desk, radiating an air of arrogant certainty. Mr. Harrison adjusted his spectacles, his expression incredibly solemn as he broke the wax seal on the thick envelope. The moment he cleared his throat and began to read, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Grandma Claire's voice echoed through the legal text, clear and unwavering. She left a few sentimental belongings to her son, Robert, but when it came to the crown jewel of her estate, the historic Victorian house, her instructions were absolute. She left the house, the land, and everything within it entirely to me, Alexia Kerr. Mr. Harrison emphasized that I had been her sole comfort and protector in her final years, and this was her ultimate gift to ensure my future. Hearing those words, a tear slipped down my cheek, a mixture of profound gratitude and intense grief. But the silence in the room was instantly shattered by a harsh, scraping sound. Marta stood up so violently that her leather chair flew backward against the wall, her face twisted into an expression of pure rage, all her carefully cultivated high society grace vanishing in an instant. She snatched the copy of the will directly from Mr. Harrison's desk, her eyes scanning the pages frantically until they landed on a quiet, single sentence written near the bottom, a strict no-contest clause stating that anyone who legally challenged this will would be automatically disqualified from receiving any other inheritance from her estate. Marta let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed uncomfortably against the office walls. She threw the papers directly into the air, letting them scatter across the carpet like useless confetti. She called the document a worthless, pathetic piece of paper drafted by a senile old woman who didn't know any better. She looked down at me, her eyes flashing with absolute venom, and declared that she would file a massive lawsuit the very next week to invalidate the entire inheritance, confident that her expensive legal team could crush my grandmother's wishes in a heartbeat. I looked past her, searching the eyes of my father, Robert. I desperately hoped to see a flicker of paternal love, a shred of decency, or at least a hint of shame for the way they were desecrating his mother's memory. Instead, he quietly looked down at his shoes, entirely submissive to his wife's outburst, nodding along with her demands. That was the exact moment my heart broke into 1,000 pieces. The betrayal was complete. The life I once knew was officially gone, and as I looked at the scattered papers on the floor, I realized I was now completely exposed to a ruthless storm, with nothing but a single, quiet sentence to protect me. But as the initial shock faded, a cold, unwavering determination took its place. I refused to let Marta and my father dismantle the sanctuary Grandma Claire had preserved for decades. The very next morning, I officially established my goal. I would protect this house with everything I had, not out of greed, but out of absolute reverence for the woman who raised me. I packed my belongings from my small apartment and moved permanently into the Victorian estate, anchoring myself within its walls to prevent them from seizing physical control of the property. My first concrete step was to secure the house. I changed all the exterior locks, reinforced the historical window latch, and installed a discreet security system around the perimeter. When Marta arrived 2 days later, eager to begin clearing out Grandma's antique furniture for an estate sale, her key turned uselessly in the lock. She pounded on the heavy oak door, her muffled shouts vibrating through the foyer. I did not open the door. I simply stood by the stained glass window, looking down at her with a calm, unyielding expression. This silent resistance only infuriated her further, and within 48 hours, she made good on her threat. A formal legal summons was delivered to my doorstep. Marta had officially filed a comprehensive lawsuit to contest the will, aggressively claiming that Grandma Claire was mentally incompetent during her final years, and that I had used undue influence to manipulate her into signing the property over to me. Marta didn't just stop at the courtroom. She launched a ruthless smear campaign against me within our extended family and local social circles. I began receiving icy judgmental emails from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, accusing me of elder abuse and dividing the family out of pure selfishness. Neighbors stared at me whenever I walked down the driveway, whispering behind manicured hedges. The emotional pressure grew exponentially heavier with each passing day. The house that was once my ultimate sanctuary felt like a fortress under siege. Marta's high-priced legal team sent continuous waves of intimidating letters, demanding access to Grandma's medical records and threatening me with massive financial ruin if I didn't settle out of court and hand over the deed. Every time the mailbox opened, my hands trembled. Yet, despite the overwhelming anxiety that kept me awake until the early hours of the morning, I adamantly refused to hire an expensive lawyer of my own. I looked at the official copy of the will resting on my nightstand, my eyes tracing that single, quiet line. I chose to trust my grandmother's brilliant, meticulous foresight, even as the storm outside grew wilder, and the weight on my shoulders became almost too much to bear. As the preliminary court date loomed closer, the isolation began to wear down my spirit. Desperate for a resolution that wouldn't completely destroy what was left of our family bond, I decided to make one final, heartbreaking attempt to appeal to my father's conscience. I called him from a public payphone near my office, asking him to meet me at a quiet diner downtown, far away from Marta's watchful eyes and sharp ears. I hoped against hope that without his wife steering his every move, the man who used to hold my hand when I was a little girl might finally stand up for the truth. He actually showed up, but the moment he sat across from me in the vinyl booth, my heart sank. Robert looked tired, his eyes refusing to meet mine as he nervously fidgeted with a sugar packet. I reached across the table, placing my hand over his, and begged him to remember his mother's final years. I reminded him of how I had stayed by her side through every painful night while he and Marta were traveling the world. I asked him how he could let his wife drag Grandma's name through the mud in a public courtroom just for a piece of real estate. For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of profound shame cross his face. But that flicker was instantly extinguished when his phone buzzed on the table, displaying a harsh text message from Marta. Robert pulled his hand away, his expression hardening into a mask of cold indifference. He looked at me and coldly stated that I was being unrealistic. He said that Marta was right, that the house was worth millions, and that it was selfish of me to keep it all to myself when the family needed the capital. He told me that if I didn't surrender the deed immediately, they would ensure I was left with absolutely nothing. He stood up, left a few crumpled bills on the table, and walked out, leaving me entirely alone. That evening I hit my absolute lowest point. I sat on the cold kitchen floor of the dark Victorian house, pulling my knees to my chest as the tears finally flowed unchecked. The silence of the massive rooms felt crushing, and for the first time, I felt utterly defeated and desperately alone. I questioned my own sanity. How could a 26-year-old architect with no legal team stand against a ruthless woman and her high-priced attorneys? Just as the darkness felt too heavy to lift, my hand brushed against the bottom cabinet of Grandma Claire's old pantry. My eyes caught a loose floorboard that I had never noticed before. Guided by a strange sense of curiosity, I pried the weathered wood loose. Tucked inside a velvet pouch was a small, leather-bound diary belonging to Grandma Claire, dated just a year before her passing. As I flipped through the delicate pages, her elegant handwriting comforted my aching soul. On the very last page, she had written a personal note specifically meant for this exact moment. A tiny, hidden door of hope swung wide open as I read her words. My sweet Alexia, when the loud world comes to tear down your peace, do not fight them with noise. Let them step into the trap of their own greed. Trust the paper, my child. I have already fought this battle for you. Those words became the anchor that held me steady when the dreaded day of the final court hearing finally arrived. The county courthouse was an intimidating cathedral of stone and marble, filled with the echoes of high-stakes conflicts. I walked into the courtroom entirely alone, dressed in a simple, tailored navy suit. I chose to sit at the defense table without a team of expensive lawyers by my side, carrying nothing but a small leather briefcase containing Grandma Claire's original will and her hidden diary. Across the aisle, the contrast could not have been more striking. Marta arrived like a conquering queen, flanked by 3 top-tier attorneys in bespoke suits who carried mountains of thick legal binders. My father, Robert, walked a few steps behind her, looking like a man completely hollowed out by his wife's ambition. Marta took her seat at the plaintiff's table, tossing her designer coat over the back of the chair, and shot me a glance filled with absolute, unchecked arrogance. She whispered something to her lead attorney, who offered a patronizing smirk in my direction, clearly expecting an effortless victory over a defenseless, grieving young woman. When the Honorable Judge Thomas took the bench, the atmosphere grew suffocatingly tense. Marta's lead attorney stood up, commanding the room with a booming theatrical voice. For 45 minutes, he launched a savage assault on my character and my relationship with my grandmother. He presented falsified testimonies from distant relatives, twisted my quiet caretaking into a sinister plot to isolate an elderly woman, and confidently argued that Grandma Claire was completely stripped of her mental faculties when she signed the deed over to me. He painting a vivid, ugly picture of manipulation, using aggressive legal jargon to demand that the will be voided immediately. As the vicious lies filled the room, my heart hammered against my ribs, and the pressure in my chest became almost unbearable. I looked over at my father, silently begging him with my eyes to stand up and stop this character assassination. But he kept his gaze firmly fixed on the wooden table, refusing to look at his own daughter. Every single piece of evidence I had prepared mentally seemed to crumble under the sheer weight of their aggressive legal presentation. The tension in the room reached its absolute peak when Marta's attorney concluded his opening statement with a triumphant flourish, resting his hands on his desk as if the case were already won. Judge Thomas adjusted his glasses, looking down at me with an expression that mixed professional sternness with a hint of quiet pity. He noted that I had waived my right to legal counsel and asked if I had any formal defense, witnesses, or counterarguments to present before he moved forward to render his final judgment. The entire courtroom fell into a heavy, breathless silence. Marta leaned back in her chair, a smug, venomous smile spreading across her face as she prepared to watch me lose everything. I was backed into an absolute corner, faced with one final, terrifying choice: to let their loud, expensive lies crush my grandmother's legacy, or to stand up and place my entire future on a single, quiet sentence. Taking a deep, stabilizing breath, I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, hearing Grandma Claire's gentle whisper echo in my mind. When I opened them, all the fear had evaporated. I stood up from my chair with absolute grace and dignity, my posture straight and my head held high. I did not look at the aggressive team of lawyers across the aisle, nor did I look at Marta. My focus was entirely on the judge. With a calm, steady voice that resonated through the silent courtroom, I stated that I had no desire to match the theatrical noise of the plaintiffs. I walked forward and gently placed Grandma Claire's original, legally notarized will on the clerk's desk, along with a certified medical evaluation conducted by Grandma's primary physician on the exact day the will was signed, proving her absolute mental clarity. I then looked directly at Judge Thomas and calmly requested the court to look past the dramatic accusations and focus on the explicit legal framework of the document, specifically page 4, paragraph 3. Judge Thomas flipped through the papers, his eyes scanning the pages until they rested on the exact section one specified, his eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. Marta leaned forward, her smug smile faltering slightly as she noticed the sudden shift in the judge's demeanor. Her lead attorney frowned, quickly flipping through his own copies to see what they had overlooked in their haste to seize the house. I turned around slowly, confronting my sources of conflict face to face for the first time. I looked directly into Marta's greedy eyes, and then at my father's pale face. With unmatched dignity, I spoke aloud the single, quiet sentence my grandmother had written years in advance. If any beneficiary or relative should choose to contest, challenge, or legally disrupt the validity of this will or any of its provisions, they shall immediately and automatically forfeit any and all other inheritances, trusts, cash allocations, or benefits otherwise granted to them from my estate. The reaction in the room was instantaneous and electric. Marta's lead attorney turned completely pale, his hands trembling slightly as he realized the massive legal blunder they had just committed. He frantically tried to speak, stuttering as he attempted to minimize the damage, but Judge Thomas sharply raised his hand to silence him. Marta, still oblivious to the severe legal trap she had walked into, loudly demanded to know what that stupid sentence had to do with her lawsuit. That was when Grandma Claire's family attorney, Mr. Harrison, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery, stood up as a designated neutral witness. He calmly explained to the court and to a freezing Martha that Grandma Claire's estate did not just consist of the Victorian house. It also included a massive, multi-million-dollar cash prevailing fund that had been quietly set up to pay out a generous monthly allowance to my father and Martha for the rest of their lives. By formally filing this lawsuit to contest the house, Martha had officially triggered the absolute no-contest clause. The look of sheer, breathless horror that washed over Martha's face as the realization hit her was a moment of absolute poetic justice. She had brought a storm of greed, only to realize Grandma had built a quiet wall that completely cut off her financial lifeblood. The silence that followed Mr. Harrison's explanation was absolute, broken only by the sharp, decisive sound of Judge Thomas bringing his gavel down with a resounding crack. The judge looked down from his bench, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy as he stared at Martha and her paralyzed legal team. He formally declared that the last will and testament of Claire Kerr was entirely valid, backed by flawless medical and legal documentation. Furthermore, he ruled that by initiating a formal lawsuit, the plaintiffs had willfully triggered the ironclad no-contest clause. With another strike of his gavel, the judge officially dismissed the lawsuit with prejudice. The house remained solely and securely mine, but the true financial collapse for my stepmother was just beginning. Because the clause was absolute, Judge Thomas ordered the immediate and permanent forfeiture of the multi-million-dollar trust fund that had previously funded Martha and my father's lavish lifestyle. All of those forfeited funds were now legally redirected to a charitable foundation Grandma Claire had established for historical preservation, leaving Martha completely empty. Martha collapsed back into her leather chair, her face pale and her breathing shallow as the sheer weight of her self-inflicted ruin set in. The expensive attorneys she had hired immediately began packing up their thick binders, their confident smiles replaced by urgent whispers about how they were going to collect their massive legal fees now that their client's primary source of income was gone. My father, Robert, sat frozen beside her, looking at his hands in absolute disbelief, finally realizing that his cowardice and submission to his wife's greed had cost them everything. There was no shouting, no explosive anger, and no violence, just the quiet, crushing weight of legal consequences. As I packed my documents back into my simple leather briefcase, my father slowly walked across the aisle toward me. For the first time in years, his eyes were wide with a mixture of regret and desperation. He reached out a trembling hand, whispering my name, likely hoping that my usual quiet and forgiving nature would lead me to offer them a financial lifeline. I stopped and looked at him, feeling a profound sense of sadness for the man he had chosen to become, but my heart remained entirely firm. I did not scold him, nor did I throw their failure in his face. I simply offered a polite, dignified nod, stepped past him, and walked out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sun. The moment I stepped through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, a tremendous weight lifted from my chest. For the first time in 4 long years, I could breathe completely freely. My life began to transform beautifully from that very afternoon. With the legal battle permanently settled, I was finally able to focus entirely on my true passion. I utilized my skills as a historical restoration architect to begin the extensive process of reviving Grandma Claire's estate. I hired local craftsmen who respected the past, and together, we began restoring the stained glass windows, reinforcing the solid oak foundations, and breathing new life into every sun-drenched corner of the house. The sanctuary was safe, my future was secure, and a beautiful new chapter of peace had finally begun. Weeks turned into months, and the grand old Victorian house flourished under my care, its freshly polished mahogany floors gleaming under the warm sunlight. I eventually completed the full restoration of the estate, turning it into a living testament to my grandmother's taste and wisdom. Every corner of the house now spoke of survival, resilience, and love. As for Martha and my father, the consequences of their choices unfolded quietly. Forced to downsize drastically and live a life stripped of superficial luxury, they finally had to face the reality of the debts they had accumulated. I never sought updates on them, nor did I harbor I simply left them behind in the past, choosing instead to fill my grandmother's house with the gentle sounds of classical music, the scent of fresh chamomile tea, and the bright laughter of true friends. Looking back at the turbulent journey that brought me here, I realized that the true value of Grandma Claire's gift was never just the physical property or the beautiful stained glass windows. Her greatest gift was teaching me that dignity cannot be bought, and that strength does not require an aggressive tongue. In a world that often rewards the loudest and most demanding voices, it is easy to believe that we must become aggressive to survive. But my journey proved the exact opposite. True power lies in integrity, careful planning, and the courage to stand firmly by the truth without matching the noise of those who wish to tear us down. A single, quiet sentence written with pure intent and foresight turned out to be sturdier than a fortress, completely dismantling a storm of malice and greed. Standing on the beautifully restored wraparound porch as the evening sun dips below the horizon, I feel a profound sense of accomplishment. I am Alexia Kerr, a historical restoration architect, a protector of memories, and a woman who chose to trust the quiet power of justice. The foundation under my feet is solid, and for the first time in my 26 years, I know exactly who I am and where I belong. The loudest person in the room might win the initial attention, but it is the quietest, most steadfast heart that ultimately wins the peace. Grandma Claire fought for my future, and today, I live that future with an open heart, ready for whatever beautiful chapters are yet to be written in this house of light. What a breathtaking journey of resilience and quiet justice. If you were in Alexia's shoes, would you have found the strength to face your family in that courtroom without saying a single angry word? How do you think you would handle a stepmother like Marta? Let me know your thoughts, feelings, and your own family stories in the comments section below. I would absolutely love to read your insights and discuss this beautiful story with you. If this emotional family drama touched your heart and inspired you to believe in the power of patience and quiet integrity, please give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell so you never miss another gripping, inspirational story of poetic justice. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, and I will see you in our next story.